Racist cop punches black pregnant woman, only to realize she's the governor's wife. The gentle warmth of the afternoon sun casts long shadows across the pristine sidewalks of Maple Heights, where elegant boutiques and carefully manicured gardens spoke of privilege and exclusivity. Rachel Montgomery stood at the corner of Cedar and Fifth, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly while the other adjusted the strap of her designer handbag. Her dark skin gleamed with a subtle sheen in the golden light, and her carefully pressed silk dress rustled softly in the spring breeze. She checked her phone again, confirming the time of her meeting with her closest friends from college. These monthly gatherings had become even more precious since her pregnancy, a chance to maintain some normalcy in a life that had become increasingly public. The boutique across the street, La Belle Vie, was their chosen meeting spot today, its window display showcasing the latest spring collection in soft pastels and flowing silks. As Rachel waited for the crossing signal, she found herself lost in thought, mentally reviewing the morning's schedule of meetings and the stack of policy briefs waiting for her attention back at the office. Her work with various children's advocacy groups had only intensified since announcing her pregnancy, as if her impending motherhood had lent even greater urgency to her mission of improving early childhood education across the state. Officer James Garrett had been patrolling this beat for nearly 7 years, and he prided himself on knowing every face that belonged in this exclusive neighborhood. From his position half a block away, he observed Rachel with growing suspicion, his fingers drumming an irregular pattern on his steering wheel. Something about her presence there didn't sit right with him. She was too well-dressed, too confident in her bearing. In his experience, that usually meant someone was trying too hard to fit in where they didn't belong. He watched as she checked her phone again, her movements unhurried and elegant. To many observers, she would have appeared exactly like any other wealthy resident of this upscale district, but Garrett had developed what he called a sixth sense for people who were out of place. He chose to ignore the voice in the back of his mind suggesting that his instincts might be colored by something other than pure professional judgment. The patrol car rolled forward slowly as Garrett made his decision. He'd seen too many high-end boutiques hit by sophisticated theft rings lately, and he wasn't about to let his guard down. The fact that she was pregnant didn't automatically make her innocent. If anything, he thought, it could be the perfect cover for criminal activity. He pulled his vehicle to the curb and stepped out, adjusting his belt with practiced authority. Rachel remained absorbed in her thoughts, unaware of the approaching officer until his shadow fell across her path. When she looked up, the sight of his stern expression and purposeful stride caused a slight falter in her previously relaxed demeanor. She'd experienced enough similar encounters in her life to recognize the look in his eyes, that mixture of suspicion and predetermined judgment that had nothing to do with any actual wrongdoing on her part. "Ma'am." Garrett's voice carried the artificial politeness of authority expecting immediate compliance. "I'm going to need to see some identification." He positioned himself directly in her path, his body language making it clear this wasn't a casual request. Rachel took a slow, careful breath, consciously relaxing her shoulders while maintaining eye contact. Years of public life had taught her the delicate balance required in such situations, the need to remain both dignified and unthreatening, assertive yet peaceful. "May I ask why you need to see my identification, officer?" Her voice was clear and steady, carrying just the right note of polite inquiry. Garrett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at her question. He'd expected immediate compliance, not questions, regardless of how politely they were posed. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," he replied, the standard response falling easily from his lips. "I'm conducting routine checks to ensure the safety of local businesses." The afternoon sun continued to beat down, and Rachel could feel a bead of sweat forming at her temple. Whether from the heat or the growing tension of the situation, she wasn't sure. Around them, the typical afternoon bustle of the shopping district continued, though a few passers-by had begun to slow their pace, attention caught by the interaction unfolding before them. Rachel's hand moved instinctively to protect her belly as she processed the officer's words. "I understand your concern for the community's safety," she began, her voice maintaining its measured tone, "but I'm simply waiting to meet some friends at La Belle Vie." She gestured toward the boutique across the street, its elegant awning casting striped shadows on the sidewalk. Garrett's eyes narrowed slightly at her composed response. Something about her self-possession grated against his expectations, challenging his assumption of authority. "That may be the case, ma'am, but I still need to see some identification." Standing around watching a high-end store could be considered suspicious behavior. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on Rachel, being considered suspicious for waiting to cross the street to enter a store. She could feel the familiar weight of these encounters settling onto her shoulders, the burden of having to justify her presence in spaces where others moved freely and without question. More pedestrians had begun to take notice of the interaction, their casual shopping interrupted by the spectacle of a visibly pregnant woman being questioned by law enforcement. A young couple slowed their pace, the woman's hand tightening on her partner's arm as they watched the scene unfold. An elderly gentleman paused in the doorway of the neighboring cafe, his morning paper forgotten in his hands. Rachel maintained her composure, though she could feel her heart rate increasing. The baby chose that moment to kick, as if responding to her elevated stress levels. She took another careful breath before speaking. "Officer, I'm not doing anything suspicious. I'm wearing a dress that I bought from this very boutique last month. I'm visibly pregnant, and I'm simply waiting for the crossing signal to meet my friends." Her reasonable explanation seemed to only agitate Garrett further. In his mind, her articulate defense transformed from a simple explanation into what he perceived as a challenge to his authority. The gathering audience added pressure to the situation, making him increasingly aware that this interaction was becoming more public than he'd intended. "Ma'am, your current condition doesn't exempt you from following police instructions," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "If you have nothing to hide, showing identification shouldn't be a problem." He shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance to appear more imposing. The sun continued its slow arc across the sky, casting shorter shadows now as midday approached. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming magnolias from the nearby park, creating an almost surreal contrast to the tension building on the sidewalk. The beautiful spring day seemed to mock the ugly situation unfolding beneath its perfect blue sky. Rachel could feel the baby moving more actively now, responding to her increasing discomfort. She maintained her outer calm, but inside, her mind was racing through possible ways to de-escalate the situation. Years of public service and navigating difficult social situations had taught her the importance of remaining collected, even as her instincts urged her to protest the injustice more forcefully. "Officer," she began again, her voice still steady but carrying a note of firmness that hadn't been there before, "I understand you're doing your job, but I want to be clear that I'm not engaged in any suspicious activity. I'm a professional woman waiting to meet friends for lunch. Would you be questioning me if I looked different?" The implication in her question hung in the air between them, heavy and unavoidable. Garrett's face flushed slightly, though whether from anger or embarrassment wasn't immediately clear. The growing number of onlookers added to his discomfort, their presence serving as silent witnesses to an interaction that was quickly spinning beyond his control. A delivery truck rumbled past, its noise momentarily drowning out the murmurs of the gathering crowd. When it passed, the silence seemed even more pronounced, filled with the electric tension of a situation balanced on a knife's edge. Rachel stood her ground, one hand still resting protectively over her unborn child, while Garrett struggled with the decision of how to proceed without losing face. The crossing signal finally changed, its cheerful chirping sound providing an almost comical counterpoint to the tense scenario playing out on the corner. But neither Rachel nor Garrett moved, locked in a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. The question of what would happen next hung in the air, as tangible as the spring sunshine that continued to beat down upon them all. The tension in the air crystallized as Officer Garrett took a step closer to Rachel, his shadow now completely enveloping her in its darkness. The pleasant spring day seemed to retreat, leaving behind a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Rachel's question about his motivations had struck a nerve, and his response came through clenched teeth. "Ma'am, you're now creating a public disturbance," he declared, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. His hand rested deliberately on his belt, inches from his radio. Your attitude is making this situation more difficult than it needs to be. Rachel felt her baby kick again, more forcefully this time, as if protesting the increasing hostility of the situation. She took a careful step back, maintaining the distance between them while scanning the faces in the crowd. Some had their phones out now, recording the interaction with expressions that ranged from concern to outright anger. "Officer Garrett," she said, reading his nameplate with deliberate care, "I'm not creating any disturbance. The only disruption here is your unnecessary questioning of a pregnant woman waiting to cross the street." Her voice remained steady, though it carried an edge of steel that seemed to surprise the officer. A young woman in business attire stepped forward from the crowd, her laptop bag clutched tightly against her chest. "She's right, you know. I've been watching this whole thing, and she was just standing here waiting for the light." Her voice trembled slightly, but she stood her ground. Garrett's head snapped toward the woman, his face flushing darker. "Ma'am, please step back. This is a police matter, and I won't have civilians interfering with my investigation." The word investigation hung in the air, seeming almost absurd in the context of a woman waiting to cross the street. Rachel felt a mixture of gratitude and concern for the woman who'd spoken up. "Please," she said softly to the bystander, "I appreciate your support, but I don't want anyone else to get involved." Her years of handling delicate political situations had taught her the importance of preventing escalation, even as her own heart raced with a combination of fear and anger. The sound of the boutique's door opening caught everyone's attention. A sales associate in an impeccable black dress stepped out, her face creased with concern. "Is everything all right out here? We've been watching from inside, and this seems unnecessary. This lady is actually expected." Before she could finish her sentence, Garrett cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Everyone needs to step back now. This situation is under control, but this woman is being uncooperative and displaying suspicious behavior." His voice had taken on a mechanical quality, as if he were reading from a script he'd memorized long ago. Rachel felt her professional calm beginning to crack, not from fear but from a deep, simmering anger at the injustice of it all. She'd spent years navigating spaces like this, building a career, earning respect, and yet here she stood, being treated like a criminal for simply existing in an upscale neighborhood. "Officer," she said, her voice taking on the tone she usually reserved for contentious policy meetings, "I want to be very clear about what's happening here. You've approached me without cause, demanded identification without justification, and are now attempting to escalate a situation that you created. I'm asking you, professionally and respectfully, to step back and reconsider your actions." The crowd had grown larger now, forming a loose semicircle around them. The morning sun cast their shadows in a long, dark arc across the sidewalk, like a sundial marking the minutes of this increasingly tense confrontation. Someone in the back of the crowd was making a phone call, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Garrett's face had become a mask of barely contained fury. Rachel's articulate challenge to his authority, delivered in front of an increasingly hostile audience, had backed him into a corner of his own making. His training taught him to de-escalate situations, but something else, pride, prejudice, or perhaps a toxic combination of both, pushed him toward confrontation. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he snapped, his professional demeanor crumbling. "Your fancy words and expensive clothes don't change the fact that you're refusing to comply with a simple request from a law enforcement officer. For all I know, you could be casing these stores, using your condition as a cover." A collective gasp rose from the crowd at his words. Rachel's hand tightened protectively over her belly, but her voice remained steady. "Officer, I want your badge number and your supervisor's contact information. This has gone far enough." The morning traffic continued to flow behind them, the everyday sounds of the city creating a surreal backdrop to the confrontation. A delivery truck beeped as it backed into an alley nearby, its warning signals mixing with the murmurs of the growing crowd. The scent of fresh coffee wafted from the nearby cafe, a cruel reminder of the normal morning Rachel should have been having. Garrett's hand moved to his radio, his fingers wrapping around it with white-knuckled intensity. "Badge number? You want my badge number?" His laugh was sharp and uncomfortable. "How about we discuss your failure to provide identification?" That's a criminal offense in certain circumstances, you know. Rachel felt her baby shift again, responding to her elevated heart rate. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself for the sake of her child. The absurdity of having to maintain composure while being harassed struck her with sudden clarity. It was a familiar dance, one she'd learned long ago, but never had the stakes felt quite so high. "Officer Garrett," she began again, her voice carrying the weight of years of similar confrontations. "We both know there's no law requiring me to show identification for standing on a public sidewalk. Your attempts to intimidate me are being recorded by multiple witnesses, and I promise you, this will not end the way you think it will." The crowd had grown larger still, with people emerging from nearby shops to witness the confrontation. The young businesswoman who had spoken up earlier had her phone held high, clearly recording everything. Others had followed suit, their devices creating a wall of electronic witnesses to the unfolding scene. "Is this really happening?" someone in the crowd muttered. In broad daylight? In 2024. Garrett's attention snapped toward the voice, his face reddening further. "This is your final warning. Everyone needs to disperse, or you'll all be cited for interfering with police business." His voice carried a tremor now, the situation having spiraled far beyond what he'd anticipated when he'd first approached Rachel. The boutique's door opened again, and this time the manager emerged, her face set with determination. "Officer, this has gone on long enough. This woman is a valued client of ours, and she's expected for an appointment. Your behavior is disrupting our business and harassing our customers." Rachel could see the moment Garrett's professional facade cracked completely. His face contorted with a mixture of embarrassment and rage, his authority challenged not just by her but now by the very business owners he claimed to be protecting. The irony might have been amusing in different circumstances. "Step back into your store, ma'am," he ordered the manager, his voice rising. "This is a police matter, and you're now interfering with an investigation." The word investigation seemed to echo off the boutique's windows, its hollowness apparent to everyone present. Rachel felt a shift in the air, a tension that went beyond the already charged atmosphere. She'd been in enough volatile situations through her work to recognize when things were about to take a dangerous turn. Her hands remained visible, one still resting on her belly, the other hanging loosely at her side, a pose she'd learned through years of navigating similar confrontations. "Officer," she said, her voice cutting through the mounting tension, "I want to be very clear about what's happening here. You are harassing a pregnant woman in front of multiple witnesses, refusing to provide your badge number, and escalating a situation without cause. I am choosing to remain calm, but do not mistake my composure for compliance with your unauthorized demands." The morning sun had risen higher, eliminating the last shadows from the street corner. The heat was building, not just from the weather, but from the pressure cooker of tension that this quiet street corner had become. Through the boutique's windows, more employees had gathered, their faces pressed against the glass, witnesses to a scene that seemed simultaneously surreal and all too familiar. Garrett's response was cut off by the sound of approaching sirens in the distance. Someone in the crowd had apparently called for additional police presence, though whether to help Garrett or to protect Rachel remained unclear. The wailing grew louder, adding another layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. The baby kicked again, more forcefully this time, and Rachel winced slightly. This small sign of discomfort seemed to trigger something in Garrett, a decision point where professional training and personal prejudice collided with devastating force. His hand moved from his radio to his belt, and the crowd tensed collectively, phones raised higher, documenting every moment of what was about to unfold. Everything happened in a heartbeat. Officer Garrett's hand shot out, fingers wrapping around Rachel's upper arm with bruising force. The sudden movement sent a ripple of shock through the crowd, phones trembling in raised hands as they captured the moment. Rachel's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence that fell over the scene. "You're under arrest for resisting a lawful police investigation," Garrett snarled, his fingers digging deeper into her flesh. The expensive silk of her dress wrinkled under his grip, the delicate fabric straining against the violence of his grasp. Rachel's free hand instinctively moved to protect her stomach as she tried to maintain her balance. "You're hurting me," she said, her voice tight with pain but still controlled. I'm pregnant, Officer Garrett.
Bleh.
ASC, remove your hand. The crowd surged forward, their collective anger palpable. The young businesswoman who had spoken up earlier called out, "Let her go. She hasn't done anything wrong." Her voice cracked with emotion, the phone in her hand streaming the entire incident live to an unseen audience. Garrett's response was to tighten his grip further. Rachel could feel the blood flow constricting in her arm, could sense the bruises forming beneath her skin. The baby inside her moved frantically, responding to her elevated heart rate and the surge of stress hormones flooding her system. "Stop resisting," Garrett commanded, though Rachel hadn't moved except to steady herself. His face was contorted with a mixture of rage and something else, perhaps the first glimmer of realization that he had crossed a line from which there would be no easy return. "I'm not resisting," Rachel replied, her voice steady despite the pain. "You are assaulting a pregnant woman who is simply waiting to cross the street. Think about what you're doing, Officer Garrett." The boutique manager had rushed back inside, and through the windows, they could see her frantically speaking into a phone. More sirens could be heard in the distance, growing closer. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, highlighting every detail of the scene, the sweat beading on Garrett's forehead, the trembling of Rachel's lip as she fought to maintain her composure, the phones recording every moment from dozens of angles. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, yet was too fast for anyone to prevent. Garrett, frustrated by Rachel's continued composure and the growing hostility of the crowd, made a fatal error in judgment. As she shifted slightly to maintain her balance, he interpreted it as resistance. His training abandoned him, replaced by raw anger and wounded pride. The punch came without warning. His free hand formed a fist and connected with Rachel's shoulder, the impact spinning her partially around. The force was enough to break his grip on her arm, sending her stumbling backward. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by shouts of horror and outrage. Rachel managed to catch herself before falling, her hands protectively cradling her pregnant belly. The pain in her shoulder bloomed like fire, radiating down her arm and across her chest. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis, the familiar street corner transforming into a nightmare landscape of violence and disbelief. The crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive. People surged forward, phones still recording but now accompanied by shouts of anger and demands for other officers to respond. Several men moved to place themselves between Rachel and Garrett, their bodies forming a protective barrier around the pregnant woman. "You just assaulted a pregnant woman," someone screamed from the crowd. "We've got it all on video," called another voice. The air was thick with outrage and the metallic taste of fear. Garrett stood frozen, his fists still partially raised, as if he himself couldn't believe what he had just done. The reality of his actions seemed to hit him all at once, and his face drained of color. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, no longer distant, but nearly upon them. Rachel pressed a hand to her shoulder, feeling the heat of the developing bruise beneath her silk dress. The baby moved frantically within her, responding to the trauma of the moment. She forced herself to take deep, steady breaths, years of crisis management training kicking in despite the shock and pain coursing through her body. The crowd had transformed from a group of concerned onlookers into an angry mob, their collective voice rising in a cacophony of outrage. Phones captured every angle of the aftermath. Rachel's disheveled appearance, her hand pressed against her shoulder, the wild look in Garrett's eyes as he realized the magnitude of his actions. "Someone call an ambulance," a voice called out from the crowd. "She's pregnant. She needs medical attention." The boutique manager had emerged again, this time with a chair from the store. She pushed through the protective circle that had formed around Rachel, offering her a place to sit. "Please, Mrs. Montdash," the manager began, catching herself as she realized she was about to reveal Rachel's identity. But the slip didn't go unnoticed by those closest to them, and a new wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Garrett's face, already pale, took on an ashen quality. Something in the manager's near slip and the way others were responding to Rachel began to penetrate the fog of his rage. His hand dropped to his side, and he took an unconscious step backward. The first police car arrived on the scene, lights flashing and siren wailing. Two officers emerged, taking in the scene with professional wariness. The angry crowd, the phones recording everything, their fellow officers standing alone while bystanders protected a visibly pregnant woman who was clearly in pain. "Officer Chen," Rachel called out to one of the newly arrived policemen, her voice carrying clearly despite her distress. "I believe we met at last month's community outreach program." The female officer's eyes widened in recognition, and her partner's head snapped around to stare at her. The crowd parted as Officer Chen rushed forward, her face a mask of concern. "Mrs. Montgomery, are you all right? What happened here?" The use of Rachel's full name sent another shockwave through the assembled onlookers, and all eyes turned to Garrett, who had gone completely still. Rachel's composure, even in the face of pain and humiliation, was remarkable. She remained seated, one hand still protectively cradling her belly while the other gently probed her injured shoulder. "Officer Garrett here," she said, her voice clear and steady, decided that a pregnant woman waiting to cross the street was suspicious. When I questioned his authority to demand identification without cause, he escalated the situation to physical violence. The sound of more sirens filled the air as additional police units and an ambulance arrived on the scene. The street had become a chaos of flashing lights and urgent voices. News vans were beginning to pull up, their crews jumping out with cameras and microphones at the ready. "Officer," Chen turned to her partner. "Call the chief. Now." Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "And get Officer Garrett secured before this gets any worse." She turned back to Rachel, her professional demeanor softening with genuine concern. "The paramedics are here, Mrs. Montgomery. Let's get you checked out." The paramedics pushed through the crowd with their equipment, their practiced efficiency creating a small island of calm in the sea of chaos. As they began to examine Rachel, the full impact of what had just occurred seemed to hit Garrett. He watched as the paramedics carefully checked Rachel's vital signs and examined her shoulder, their movements witnessed by dozens of phones still recording every moment. The boutique manager had retrieved Rachel's fallen handbag, handling it with careful respect. The leather accessory, which probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, served as another reminder of just how badly Garrett had misread the situation. The designer label, the elegant clothes, the refined manner of speech, all the signs he had interpreted as suspicious were actually indicators of exactly who Rachel was, if he had only been able to see past his own prejudices. The crowd continued to grow as word spread through the neighborhood. Social media was already exploding with videos of the incident, and the first tweets about a police officer assaulting the governor's pregnant wife were beginning to go viral. The quiet street corner had become ground zero for what would surely become a national story about police brutality, racial profiling, and the abuse of power. The wail of another approaching vehicle cut through the chaos, this one different from the others. Not the urgent scream of police sirens or ambulances, but the distinctive sound of a government security detail. A black SUV with tinted windows and official plates rounded the corner at high speed, followed by two identical vehicles. The crowd parted instinctively as the motorcade pulled up to the curb. The first person to emerge was Marcus Chen, the governor's chief of staff, his typically immaculate appearance showing signs of haste, tie slightly askew, suit jacket buttoned incorrectly. His face was a mask of controlled fury as he surveyed the scene, quickly locating Rachel amid the cluster of paramedics and concerned onlookers. "Clear a path," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. The crowd shifted immediately, creating a corridor through which a stream of serious-faced men and women in professional attire began to move, their government credentials clearly visible on lanyards around their necks. Sarah Martinez, the governor's lead security coordinator, was already on her phone, speaking rapidly into her earpiece. "Target is secure but injured. Medical assistance on scene." "Yes, sir." "Understanding the situation now." "No, sir, you should not come personally. We'll handle it." Her free hand rested on her holstered weapon, eyes scanning the crowd with professional assessment. Officer Garrett, who had been standing in shocked silence as the situation spiraled beyond his control, felt his knees weaken as recognition dawned. The governor's staff, the government vehicles, the professional security detail. His mind raced back through every moment of the confrontation, Every word spoken, every action taken, now viewed through the horrifying lens of understanding exactly who he had assaulted. Rachel remained seated, allowing the paramedics to continue their examination while simultaneously acknowledging the arrival of her staff with a slight nod. Despite the pain and humiliation she had endured, she maintained an air of dignity that seemed to command respect from everyone present, everyone except the one officer who had failed to see it earlier. Marcus Chen reached Rachel's side, kneeling down beside her chair. "Rachel," he said softly, dropping professional formality in his concern, "how badly are you hurt? Do we need to get you to the hospital?" His eyes flickered to her pregnant belly, worry evident in his expression. "I'm all right, Marcus," Rachel replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "The baby's moving normally and the paramedics think my shoulder is just bruised. But we need to handle this situation carefully. There are bigger issues at stake here than my injury." The gathered crowd had grown quieter, straining to hear the exchange between Rachel and her staff. The realization of her identity was spreading through the assembled onlookers like a wave, phones still raised but now accompanied by whispered conversations and shocked expressions. Sarah Martinez had positioned herself between Rachel and Officer Garrett, her stance protective and her expression hard. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority that Garrett had tried and failed to project earlier, "I suggest you remain exactly where you are until this situation can be properly documented." The paramedic examining Rachel's shoulder looked up at Marcus. "The injury appears to be a deep tissue bruise, but given Mrs. Montgomery's condition, we'd strongly recommend a full examination at the hospital. We need to ensure there's no risk to the pregnancy from the physical trauma and stress." Officer Chen, who had been coordinating with her superior officers via radio, approached the group. "Chief Williams is en route personally," she reported, her professional demeanor masking her own shock at the situation. "He's requested that everyone maintain their positions until he arrives. All body cam footage has been flagged for immediate review." The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, its heat now intense enough to make the assembled crowd shift uncomfortably. The beautiful spring day seemed to mock the gravity of the situation unfolding beneath its cheerful brightness. News helicopters had begun to circle overhead, their distant chopping adding to the surreal atmosphere. Rachel adjusted her position slightly, wincing as the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her injured shoulder. A young aide quickly stepped forward, offering her a bottle of water and a supportive hand. The simple gesture of care seemed to highlight the absurdity of the violence she had endured moments before. Marcus Chen had moved slightly aside to take a call, his voice low but intense as he presumably spoke with the governor's office. "Yes, sir." "No. She's stable but injured. The security team is implementing standard protocols." "Understanding, sir." "Yes, we're managing the media situation now." The boutique manager had gathered her staff near the entrance, all of them providing statements to a police detective who had arrived on scene. Their faces showed a mixture of shock and anger as they recounted the events they had witnessed through the store windows. Officer Garrett remained rooted to his spot, his face a study in dawning horror as more details about Rachel's identity emerged in the conversations swirling around him. Every few seconds, his eyes would dart to Rachel, then to the government vehicles, then to the growing media presence, as if trying to convince himself this was all a terrible dream. A senior aide approached Rachel with a tablet, showing her something on the screen. "Ma'am, the incident is already trending nationwide. Multiple videos have gone viral. The governor's office is preparing a statement, but they'd like your input on the approach." Rachel studied the screen briefly before looking up at her staff. "We need to focus on the systemic issues this incident represents, not just my personal experience. This isn't about who I am, it's about who I could have been. Any other pregnant woman of color could have been standing on that corner today." Her words carried to the nearby crowd, and several people nodded in agreement. The young businesswoman who had first spoken up was still recording, but now tears streaked her face as she watched the scene unfold. Sarah Martinez's phone buzzed with an incoming message. After reading it, she turned to Marcus. "The governor's motorcade has left the Capitol building despite our recommendations. He's en route." She paused, checking another alert. and the Attorney General's office is sending a representative. This has officially become a state-level incident. The police chief's vehicle pulled up to the scene, its arrival causing another shift in the crowd's attention. Chief Williams emerged, his face set in grim lines as he took in the scene before him. His eyes moved from Rachel, still being attended by paramedics, to Officer Garrett, standing isolated and pale, to the assembled government staff and growing media presence. "Mrs. Montgomery," the chief said as he approached, his voice carrying genuine concern, "on behalf of the department, I want to express our deepest dash." Rachel held up a hand, stopping his words. "Chief Williams, I understand you need to address this officially, but right now, I'm more concerned about what this incident represents. Officer Garrett didn't know who I was when he approached me, when he grabbed me, or when he struck me. That's precisely the point we need to discuss." The chief's expression shifted, understanding dawning in his eyes as he recognized the larger implications of what had occurred. Behind him, Officer Garrett seemed to shrink further into himself as the full weight of his actions and their inevitable consequences began to settle on his shoulders. The sound of more approaching vehicles filled the air as the governor's motorcade drew near. Rachel straightened in her chair, smoothing her dress with her uninjured hand, preparing to face what would come next. Despite the pain and humiliation she had endured, her face showed only determination, a clear indication that she intended to transform this personal trauma into something meaningful. Officer Garrett felt the ground beneath his feet dissolve into quicksand as the full magnitude of his situation crashed over him in relentless waves. Each passing moment brought new revelations about exactly who Rachel Montgomery was, each detail landing like another nail in the coffin of his career. The governor's wife, a respected civil rights advocate, the chair of the state's early childhood education initiative. Every new piece of information made his actions seem more egregious, more indefensible. His eyes darted frantically between the faces surrounding him, the stern expressions of senior officers, the barely contained fury of government officials, the open hostility of the crowd, and the calm dignity of Rachel herself. The morning's events played on endless loop in his mind, each moment now twisted by the horrifying knowledge of exactly who he had assaulted. "I didn't know," he whispered, the words escaping unbidden from his lips. "I didn't know who she was." A voice cut through the crowd, sharp and clear. Would it have made a difference? An elderly black woman stepped forward, her gray hair caught in the morning sunlight. "Would you have treated her with respect if you'd known she was the governor's wife? And what does that say about how you treat the rest of us?" The question hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. Garrett opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. What could he say? That yes, he would have behaved differently if he'd known Rachel's status? That admission would only prove the point being made. The crowd's energy had transformed from the initial shock and outrage into something more focused, more purposeful. Phones were still recording, but now people were organizing, sharing contact information, discussing witness statements. A law student in the crowd was helping people document their observations while they were still fresh. "Officer Garrett," came the chief's voice, cutting through a spiral of panic. "Surrender your badge and weapon. You're suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation." The words were delivered with quiet authority, but the public nature of the command made it feel like a shout. With trembling hands, Garrett began to unfasten his duty belt. The crowd watched in complete silence as he handed over his service weapon, the metal catching the sunlight as it passed from his hands to the chief's. The badge followed, the gold shield looking somehow tarnished despite its polished surface. "I was just doing my job," he attempted, his voice cracking. "There have been reports of suspicious activity in the area, and I dash." "Stop talking," interrupted Sarah Martinez, her voice sharp as a blade. "Every word you say is being recorded by dozens of devices. I suggest you exercise your right to remain silent before you make this situation even worse for yourself." The growing media presence had transformed the quiet street corner into an impromptu press conference location. Reporters were positioning themselves for the best camera angles, their voices creating a steady murmur of live broadcasts and phone calls to editors. Sources confirmed that the officer involved has been immediately suspended. The governor is en route to the scene, Witnesses report that the officer struck Mrs. Montgomery without provocation. The overlapping voices created a chorus of condemnation, each new detail adding to the weight pressing down on Garrett's shoulders. He watched as medical personnel continued to attend to Rachel, their careful movements and concerned expressions a constant reminder of his inexcusable actions. A young black mother in the crowd held her own baby closer, tears streaming down her face as she watched the scene unfold. "That could have been me," she said to no one in particular, her voice carrying in a momentary lull in the noise. "Any day, any street corner, that could be any one of us." The truth of her words seemed to ripple through the crowd, drawing nods of recognition and murmurs of agreement. Rachel, still seated but maintaining her composure, turned toward the woman's voice. Their eyes met across the space, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Garrett felt the weight of that exchange, the reality of what his actions represented crushing down on him with devastating force. Every attempt at justification died in his throat as he watched the scene he had created continue to unfold. His mind raced through his years of training, searching frantically for something, anything that could explain or excuse his behavior. The department's community relations officer had arrived and was speaking urgently into her phone. "Yes, we need to get ahead of this. The videos are already viral. Multiple angles showing clear excessive force against a pregnant woman. Yes, the governor's wife. No, there's no spinning this one." The boutique manager had emerged again, this time carrying a glass of water and a small first aid kit. As she approached Rachel, her movement caught Garrett's attention, and he noticed for the first time the boutique's window display. There, prominently featured, was a photo of Rachel Montgomery herself, wearing one of their designs at a recent charity event. The image seemed to mock him. The same woman he had deemed suspicious enough to assault had been literally on display in front of him the entire time. "Officer," a voice drew his attention back to the present. It was his union representative, arriving slightly out of breath. "Don't say anything else. Not to anyone. This situation is..." The rep paused, searching for appropriate words. "This is unprecedented." The crowd had started chanting now, their voices rising in a rhythmic call for justice. The sound carried down the street, drawing more onlookers, more phones, more witnesses to his humiliation. Some held up hastily made signs, the ink still wet. "Protect Black mothers and no more abuse of power." Garrett watched as a door opened in one of the government SUVs and a staff member emerged with a fresh blazer for Rachel, a small gesture of dignity to replace her silk dress, now wrinkled and stained from his assault. The simple act of kindness made his throat tighten with shame. "You're going to want to leave now," Officer Chin said quietly at his elbow. "We'll escort you out the back way. The media's going to be all over this, and you don't want to make any statements without proper representation." As if to emphasize her words, another news van pulled up, its satellite dish extending skyward. The story was growing, spreading, taking on a life of its own. His actions, born of prejudice and pride, were about to become a national conversation about power, race, and justice. The crowd's chanting grew louder, more organized. Someone had started a live stream, reading out comments from viewers around the country. The number of viewers climbed rapidly. 5,000, 10,000, 25,000. The incident was no longer just a local scandal, it was becoming a movement. Rachel Montgomery slowly rose from her chair, one hand still resting protectively over her belly, the other gingerly testing her injured shoulder. The paramedics moved to assist her, but she gently waved them away. The crowd fell silent as she stood, their collective attention drawn to her presence, like moths to a flame. "I want to address everyone here," she began, her voice clear and steady despite the morning's trauma. "What happened to me today is not unique. It's not special. The only difference is that I have a name people recognize, a position that commands attention." She paused, her eyes scanning the assembled faces. But this same story plays out every day across our state, across our country, without cameras, without witnesses, without consequences. The silence that followed her words was profound, broken only by the whir of news cameras and the distant thrum of helicopter blades. Even the reporters held their microphones still, caught in the gravity of the moment. "I stand here as a woman who has spent years working within the system," Rachel continued, her hand absently rubbing her pregnant belly as she spoke. "I've sat on committees, drafted policies, attended countless meetings about police reform and community relations. And yet today, none of that mattered. To Officer Garrett, I wasn't a person deserving of respect or dignity. I was simply a black woman who didn't belong in his view of this neighborhood." Marcus Chin stepped forward, concern etched on his face. "Rachel, perhaps we should wait for the governor to arrive before making any statements." His words were gentle, but carried the weight of political consideration. Rachel turned to him, her expression resolute. "No, Marcus. This needs to be said now, while the pain is fresh, while the bruises are still forming. This isn't about politics, it's about human dignity." She turned back to the crowd, her voice gaining strength. "Every woman who has ever felt afraid during a police encounter, every mother who has had to teach her children how to survive rather than thrive, every person who has been judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character, this moment belongs to all of them." The young mother who had spoken earlier pressed forward slightly, her baby clutched to her chest. "Mrs. Montgomery," she called out, her voice trembling with emotion. "What can we do? How do we make this stop?" Rachel's eyes met hers, and in that moment, the connection between them transcended social status and circumstance. "We document. We witness. We speak up. But most importantly, we demand real change, not just performative gestures." She turned slightly, addressing the police chief directly now. "Chief Williams, I don't want Officer Garrett's suspension to be the end of this conversation. I want a complete review of departmental policies, training procedures, and accountability measures." The police chief nodded solemnly, aware that every camera was capturing his response. "Mrs. Montgomery, you have my word that this incident will be thoroughly investigated and necessary changes will be implemented." "With all due respect, Chief," Rachel replied, her voice firm but diplomatic, "your word isn't enough anymore. We need concrete action, transparent processes, and community involvement in every step of reform. The time for promises is past. This is a moment for fundamental change." Behind her, the paramedics exchanged worried glances, concerned about the strain this impromptu speech might be putting on their patient. But Rachel stood straight and strong, her presence commanding despite the visible signs of her ordeal, the wrinkled dress, the disheveled hair, the way she held her injured arm close to her body. A law student in the crowd had begun taking down names and contact information from witnesses, organizing them into a potential legal action. The atmosphere had shifted from one of chaos and outrage to focused determination. Rachel noticed this and nodded approvingly. "This is how change begins," she continued, gesturing to the organizing taking place. "Not just through high-level policy discussions, but through grassroots action. Every person here today is now part of something larger than themselves. Your videos, your testimonies, your presence, these are the tools of accountability." Sarah Martinez appeared at Rachel's side, speaking quietly but urgently. "The governor's motorcade is 2 minutes out, and your doctor is insisting that you get to the hospital for a full examination." Rachel acknowledged the information with a slight nod, but didn't pause in her address. "I want to be clear about something else," she said, her voice carrying across the now silent crowd. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident. This is about a system that made Officer Garrett feel empowered to approach a pregnant woman without cause, to escalate a peaceful situation into violence, and to assume that his badge would protect him from consequences." The crowd murmured in agreement, phones still raised, capturing every word. Social media was exploding with clips of her speech, each one going viral as it was posted. The incident had transformed from a local story of police misconduct into a national conversation about systemic racism and accountability. "To every woman who has ever been made to feel unsafe in her own community," Rachel continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "to every parent who has had to have the talk with their children about surviving police encounters, to every person who has been profiled, harassed, or assaulted, your stories matter. Your lives matter. And this moment of reckoning is for you." The sound of approaching motorcycles announced the governor's imminent arrival, but Rachel remained focused on her message. "I stand here not just as the governor's wife, not just as a victim of police brutality, but as a Black woman who refuses to let this incident be minimized or forgotten. The bruises will heal, but the system that allowed this to happen must be transformed." She paused, taking a deep breath as the baby kicked, as if adding its own emphasis to her words. "I'm asking everyone here, everyone watching, to commit to being part of that transformation. Document everything. Speak up when you witness injustice. Demand accountability from your elected officials and law enforcement leaders. But most importantly, don't let this be just another incident that fades from the headlines without creating real change." The governor's motorcade pulled up to the scene, but all eyes remained fixed on Rachel. She stood there, one hand still cradling her pregnant belly, the other held carefully against her injured shoulder, a living testament to both the injustice she had faced and the strength with which she was confronting it. "This ends today," she declared, her voice carrying the weight of both personal pain and public purpose. "Not just for me, but for every person who has ever been made to feel less than human by those sworn to protect and serve. The time for change isn't coming, it's here. And we all have a part to play in making it real." The crowd erupted in supportive applause and calls of agreement, their voices rising in a chorus of determination. Rachel's words had transformed a moment of personal trauma into a catalyst for collective action, and everyone present could feel the weight of that transformation. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital waiting room where a crowd had gathered: government officials, police brass, community leaders, and media representatives. The morning's events had spiraled into a phenomenon that demanded immediate attention from every level of state government. Outside, protesters had begun to gather, their signs visible through the large windows: "Justice for Rachel" and "Reform Now" catching the golden light. Governor James Montgomery emerged from the private room where Rachel was being examined, his face a study in contained fury and public composure. The usually affable politician's expression was stern as he approached the assembled group, his security detail moving in practiced formation around him. "The doctors have confirmed that both Rachel and our baby are stable," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of both personal relief and professional authority. "The physical injuries are relatively minor, bruising to her shoulder and upper arm." However, he paused, his jaw tightening. The emotional impact of being assaulted while pregnant, of being profiled and harassed in broad daylight, that's not something that can be measured in a medical examination. Chief Williams stepped forward, his dress uniform immaculate, but his expression troubled. "Governor, I want to assure you that Officer Garrett has been suspended without pay pending a full investigation. We're reviewing all body camera footage, witness statements, and social media videos of the incident." "That's not enough, Chief," the governor replied, his voice level but firm. "My wife was assaulted because your officer saw a Black woman in an upscale neighborhood and automatically assumed she didn't belong there. The fact that she happens to be the governor's wife shouldn't be what makes this incident noteworthy." The hospital's conference room had been transformed into an impromptu command center. Screens displayed social media feeds where the hashtag #JusticeForRachel was trending nationwide. News outlets were running constant coverage, showing the viral videos of the confrontation alongside Rachel's powerful speech at the scene. Marcus Chen was coordinating with various department heads, his laptop open to a document that grew longer by the minute. "The Attorney General's office has opened a civil rights investigation," he reported. "The state legislature is calling for emergency sessions to discuss police reform legislation. And we're receiving solidarity statements from civil rights organizations across the country." In another corner of the room, Sarah Martinez was reviewing security protocols with her team. "This changes everything," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "We need to reassess how we handle Mrs. Montgomery's public appearances. The fact that she was alone on that street corner." "Stop right there," came Rachel's voice from the doorway. She stood there in a fresh outfit brought by her staff, her injured arm in a sling, but her bearing regal. "I won't live in fear. I won't hide away. That would be letting them win." The room fell silent as Rachel moved carefully to take a seat at the conference table. The governor moved to her side, his hand resting protectively on her uninjured shoulder. The assembled officials watched as she opened her laptop, revealing a document she had apparently been working on during her medical examination. "I've drafted a preliminary outline for police reform legislation," she announced, her voice clear and professional despite the day's trauma. "It addresses not just use of force protocols, but the underlying issues of racial profiling, implicit bias, and community oversight. I want this on the legislative agenda immediately." The state attorney general, who had arrived an hour earlier, leaned forward with interest. "Mrs. Montgomery, we can fast-track this through committee. The political will is there, especially given the circumstances." "No," Rachel said firmly, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly as the baby kicked. "This isn't about me or what happened today. This legislation needs to stand on its own merits. We're going to do this right, with community input, expert testimony, and proper debate. What happened to me happens to people across this state every day. The only difference is they don't have my platform to demand change." Outside the hospital, the crowd of protesters had grown larger. Their chants could be heard through the windows, a rhythmic demand for justice and reform. Local community organizers had set up voter registration booths nearby, transforming the spontaneous gathering into organized political action. Officer Garrett, meanwhile, sat in a union lawyer's office across town, watching his career and reputation unravel on multiple news channels simultaneously. His personnel file had been leaked to the media, revealing a history of civilian complaints that had been largely ignored. Each detail added fuel to the growing fire of public outrage. The governor's office just released their official statement, Marcus announced, reading from his tablet. "They're calling for a comprehensive review of police practices across the state, with emphasis on racial profiling and use of force against pregnant women and other vulnerable populations." Rachel nodded, then winced slightly as the movement jarred her injured shoulder. "Make sure the press understands that this goes beyond one incident or one officer. This is about systemic change." She turned to the police chief. "Chief Williams, I want to work with your department on this. Not as the governor's wife or as a victim, but as someone who believes in the possibility of real reform." The chief nodded solemnly, aware that cameras were capturing this moment for the evening news. "Mrs. Montgomery, your grace under these circumstances is remarkable. We welcome your input and leadership in this process." "It's not about grace," Rachel replied, her voice carrying a steel edge despite her diplomatic tone. "It's about turning this moment into movement. Every person who witnessed what happened today, everyone who's watching these videos and sharing these stories, they're all part of this now. We have a responsibility to make sure their voices are heard." As the sun began to set outside the hospital windows, casting a warm glow across the room, the assembled officials continued their work. Rachel's laptop screen reflected the light as she typed, documenting every detail of her experience while it was still fresh. The baby moved within her, a constant reminder of why this fight was so important, not just for her child, but for every child who would grow up in this state, in this country. The day's events had transformed a quiet morning into a catalyst for change, a moment of personal trauma into a movement for justice. As Rachel continued to work, surrounded by the machinery of government springing into action, she remained focused on one simple truth. Real change would come not from the shock of her story, but from the thousands of untold stories that her experience had finally brought to light.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.